Hello and welcome to week 5 of the GatesAir Connect virtual event webinar series. Today's webinar, Digital Radio, a review of the latest standards, HDRadio, DAB, and DRM. Our very own Rich Redmond, president of GatesAir International, will discuss digital radio, which offers a wide range of services beyond simple audio delivery. He will present the most popular standards available today, status of the technology, advanced features offered, new revenue streams enabled, receiver availability, and cost to deploy. Before we begin this presentation today, we're just going to take a quick 3-minute break to allow everyone that's registered a chance to join. Sit back, relax, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GatesAir Connect virtual events webinar series. This is Teresa Crippen, Global Events Manager for GatesAir. We really appreciate all of you connecting with us today during today's webinar. In place of many face-to-face events and trade shows that have been canceled, we have lots of content available for you that we've recorded over the past few weeks, and also events that are upcoming. So be sure to view those online and also connect with us on upcoming webinars. In today's webinar, Digital Radio, a review of the latest standards, HDRadio, DAB, and DRM, our very own Rich Redmond, president of GatesAir International, will discuss digital radio, which offers a wide range of services beyond simple audio delivery. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and we encourage you to type in your questions that you might have in the Microsoft Teams Q&A panel, and I'll post an announcement now so that you can see where to post those. Okay, that message is up there, so you should be able to find that. So feel free to enter your questions as soon as you think of them. We'll answer those questions after the presentation in the order in which they were received. Without further delay, let's start the webinar. Please welcome Mr. Rich Redmond. Rich?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hello to everyone. Let's see, we'll get the event going here. There, looks like we got that up. So today we're going to talk a little bit about digital radio, some comparisons to analog, and we're going to talk about the predominantly used digital radio standards. So, I thought at first I'd talk a little bit about radio in general and just some trends. There's always a lot of discussion about where things are going. A little bit about analog compared to, I'm picking three standards. FM analog radio, HD radio, DRM/DRM plus, and DAB plus, and we'll talk a little bit about the technologies behind those. Now, of note, DRM and HD radio also work on the AM band. DRM works in shortwave, and there is another standard used in China called China Digital Radio, or CDR, which is somewhat similar to HD radio, but we won't be exploring that specifically today, but many of the comparisons using HD radio are applicable. Talk a little bit about the cost comparisons of some of the network topologies, which might be surprising. A little bit about operational costs, and then some of the technologies that impact how these networks are deployed or stations are deployed. And then kind of a snapshot of deployments around the world where people are actually turning on digital radio and what that looks like, and then a little bit about receivers, because while transmitters sending out digital content's great, if you can't hear anything, it's an engineering exercise. So, a lot of times we have this discussion and someone will talk about radio, and there'll always be somebody who will elaborate that no one's listening to the radio. Well, factually, in the United States, 92% of people, over the age of the 12, listen to the radio every week. In fact, it's a pretty dominant medium from that standpoint. And this is just, everyday, radio. And you say, well, that's interesting, Rich, but, the United States isn't the rest of the world. But if you look at a lot of leading first world countries, it's fairly similar, all generally above 90% on average. If you look in the US, Germany, Austria, France, I know when we look at places like Australia, it's fairly similar. So, radio still is a part of everyone's lives every day, and is a compelling medium. And interestingly, when you look at what people listen to as they compare to other types of sources of media, radio still comes out as the leader, even beating out, television and both broadcast TV, cable, and so forth. So, yeah, certainly streaming is in some cases a complement to radio if it's, another delivery method of some of the same content, whether it be live streams or, recorded streams, podcasts, and so forth, or whether it be, streaming only platforms. A lot of people certainly are trying to grab the listener's attention, but, radio continues to be a dominant media. And, I think that kind of lines up well for, digital radio is kind of the evolution of the delivery platform, and one that brings not only the ability to deliver audio, but a number of other services, some of which are complementary to the audio and some of which are unrelated to the audio, such as, traffic data or other things that are delivered. So the three major platforms or technologies we're going to talk about today: DAB, which is generally talking about a broad suite of standards, at one point referred to as the Eureka 147 suite of families. There's a industry organization called World DAB that is kind of the standards body for this, and also a supportive organization. So in DAB, DAB uses band 3 VHF, or if we think about in the United States, high band VHF, channels 7 through 13. It has been deployed in L band before, 1492, megahertz, but generally that never really saw any broad adoption, and in some places that frequency has been turned back in to the regulators for other use. It turned out to be not very practical. So in this case, much like I would say digital television in deployments in much of Europe or Australia, there's common transmission infrastructure. It occupies 1.7 or 1.5 megahertz of RF bandwidth. So within a television channel, you can generally fit 4 DAB multiplexes. So in Europe, for example, there are 8 megahertz TV channels. So if I had channel 10, I could put 4 DAB muxes, which would be 10 A, B, C, and D, all put in that same channel bandwidth. So it can live right next to digital television channels. Supports multiple audio channels, and we'll talk a little bit about how many that can support. But it also has the ability to support video channels. So most notably, a version of DAB referred to as DMB is used in Korea for mobile television and delivering targeted content to handheld devices. HDRadio, commonly used in North America, in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, as well as some other locations, and we'll talk about that. HDRadio reuses existing AM and FM frequencies that broadcasters are on today, and it supports simultaneous analog and digital transmission. So if you're an AM or FM broadcaster, if I'm on 99.5 megahertz for my FM channel, I can use that. I can add digital to it. I don't need new spectrum. So this is a point where it's a little bit different than DAB, which if I were an FM broadcaster, I would need to secure, or I would need to secure with a group of others access to what is generally viewed as television spectrum in many countries. And of course, HDRadio supports multiple audio channels and has a wide array of other data services, as well as program associated services as album art and other interactive content that can be used associated with the audio. HDRadio is a technology from a company called Xperi, and they market it under the HDRadio brand name. DRM, not digital rights management, but Digital Radio Mondiale, is an international standard that supports shortwave, AM, FM, and will allow you to broadcast digital content on any of these frequencies. While it is in the same frequency band, it generally occupies the entire channel for digital, where HDRadio allows you to maintain your analog and add digital sidebands. DRM requires you generally to pick. Now in AM, you can partition a portion of your area. You can kind of shift the AM frequency to one side and have digital adjacent to it. In FM, it requires an additional channel. So it's not quite the same spectrum use. It's more similar to HDRadio, but not exactly the same. So it does support multiple audio channels, and it does have some additional data services. Now, each of these differ in terms of where they're deployed in the world and the types of radios available. But the common thing is for digital, they all use OFDM types of modulation. So this is a similar type of modulation used in virtually all other digital media networks. So whether you're talking about digital television, most notably DVB, DVB-T2, ISDBT in Japan and Brazil, ATSC 3.0 in the US. ATSC1, or traditional ATSC, is a single carrier system, so it's a little bit different. The benefits of OFDM, in addition to being a robust modulation platform, also really allow for very nice use of single frequency networks. But in any case, to access these digital technologies, a new receiver is necessary in all of them. So receiver availability becomes a pretty big deal. Now, when we think about this, and this chart here just gives you a quick snapshot of FM, DAB, and DRM, and then I'll look at HDRadio. But at the bottom, you can kind of see the point I was making. FM that we're used to is a single carrier system. We frequency modulate the carrier. When you look at DAB or if you look at DRM and then the sidebands for HD radio, there are a series of carriers that all pop up within a certain bandwidth. So the core modulations are a little bit different. These are, when we talk about power levels in DAB or DRM, we're talking about RMS power, where, in FM it's generally peak power. Now FM, what we're used to, one frequency, one audio channel, albeit you do have the opportunity to use subcarriers for some low bandwidth audio, but generally from a program service, it's one audio stream per frequency. When we talk about the other digital standards, all of them, the commonality is it breaks the barrier of one audio channel per frequency. DAB, you can use a large number of audio channels, typically somewhere between 18 to upwards to 30 on a multiplex, and in DRM plus, it could be, it's generally 1 to 3, sometimes upwards of 4. And then they all generally include some sort of program associated data, non-program associated data. Each of them has a little bit different transport stream, and we'll talk about what that topology looks like. One of the big differences, is that generally when we think of FM or analog radio, we're sending audio either in an analog domain or digital domain to the transmitter site, and at the transmitter is when it turns that into RF and modulates the carrier and goes out over the air. And the digital standards, there's some equipment that's added before the transmitter that provides a certain amount of encoding, and we'll talk about that. HD radio, I mentioned, has digital sidebands. So the center is our traditional analog FM signal, and then in the United States, the FM mask, protected mask, we add 2 sets of redundant digital carriers. So there's simultaneous information on both sides, which allows them to be fairly robust. And they're anywhere from 10 dB to 20 dB below the peak level of the analog carrier. And that determines your digital power. Generally, these are broadcast through the same transmitter, albeit a special transmitter that allows you to broadcast digital and analog together. There are other topologies where you can use separate digital transmitters and combine them in a passive combiner or in the antenna. But these days, the most common implementation is what's called common amplification. And an FM transmitter is linearized so it can pass both analog and digital signals. So from the standpoint of your average listener, they continue to get analog just as they always did. There's a digital version of the main channel, and then there will be other content. So this is where, when we talk about using your existing frequency, there are these digital sidebands on either side of the analog carrier, where in each of the other standards, generally a different frequency allocation is required to use digital in DAB or DRM. Now, I mentioned all of them allow you to use multiple channels for per frequency. Here's just a snapshot of typically how on an FM HD radio this might be allocated. In the different scenarios, you may have anywhere from, one, I could just have a replication of my analog signal in digital, or you could go to four different channels of digital audio content. And so these represent the number of kilobits that might be allocated to do that. Now, when most digital standards were invented, DAB, came out in the end of the 90s. HD radio really was first starting in the early 2000s, and DRM in a similar time frame. Digital audio compression was not as advanced as it is today. So in early DAB, for example, much more bandwidth was required just to have a usable stereo signal because it was using MPEG-1 compression. The standards now all have gone to a version of AAC plus, high efficiency typically. They're all a little bit different, but generally, variants of the same theme, which allow you to get pretty good sounding audio and fairly low bit rates. So pretty big advancements. And I mention that because, there was, in the early days of digital, both in DAB, like I mentioned with MPEG-1, lower bit rates sounded pretty poor, and in some of the early days of HD radio, there were other codecs used that required substantially more bandwidth to sound passable. But today, compression algorithms are generally pretty reliable. Now, I'll do a comparison here. The top is what we think of as traditional FM. The bottom, while I've picked DAB for the comparison, I'll kind of draw analogies to the other digital standards. They're somewhat similar. But in a traditional FM radio, we have content that comes from the studio. There's some sort of distribution mechanism. Now, if the studio were co-located with the transmitter, that might just be a wire running down the hallway. But usually the transmitter's is located remotely from the studio. And in that case, we use a distribution link, a STL or studio to transmitter link. So this could be microwave, it could be satellite, it could be IP, it could be a TDM, or in some cases analog phone circuits. As I mentioned before, the transmitter includes the exciter. So in this device, I'm not only amplifying the signal, but I'm converting it from baseband audio and I'm modulating it on the carrier. Then there's some sort of feeder line that takes it to an antenna. When we go to digital, first, as we talked about earlier, there's multiple audio channels have to go into a transport stream. Now, in DAB, because it's shared infrastructure, this may come from multiple studios that are located in different locations, not one location. And at some point, we generally refer to a box as a head-end system. And in this case, it pulls together these multiple audio channels that may come from in the adjacent rack or down the hallway, or it could come from some other location, multiplexes them together in a transport stream. In DAB, it's could be over IP using EDI or a traditional E1 architecture using EDI. Same type of transport mechanisms we talked about before, satellite, RF microwave, an IP or TDM network. This transport stream goes into the transmitter, and then at the output of the transmitter, there's some sort of filter. So for traditional FM operators, a filter at the output of the transmitter is not very common. In television, analog television, and digital television, it's a fairly common, in fact, required piece of the equation. And so this filters the sidebands down to ensure that close-in unwanted emissions meet the mask performance. This is usually done in HD radio using adaptive correction. There is adaptive correction for DAB and digital TV as well, but it requires the combination of filters. And then there's a feed line and antenna. Now, the areas in red I've highlighted are some of the areas that are a little bit different than what we think of in traditional analog. Now, as I mentioned in DAB, this head end, which is basically a combination of audio encoding and then multiplexing, can take, in this case, 18 radio programs of good quality audio to put into the multiplex. This is also where other IP content comes in. When we think about HD radio, it's somewhat similar. So the importer and exporter, kind of at the bottom of this stack, are analogous to the head end in DAB. And as I mentioned earlier, this step is a little bit different than what we think of an analog, in that these devices take audio either in the digital or analog format, encode them into whatever the required encoding mechanism is, and then multiplex them into a transport stream that then goes to, in this case, the HD radio exciter or XGen card that might be in the exciter. And then it goes into the transmitter, which is an amplifier. So as you'll note here, it still goes out to an antenna, which is above the top, but in HD radio, we generally don't use channel filters or bandpass filters at the output like are required in DAB. Now, DRM has a similar topology. In that case, it's referred to as a content server instead of an importer or exporter, but the functionality is very similar. It it takes data inputs and audio inputs and multiplexes it into a transport stream. So in our case, in our Fax Flexiva family of transmitters, we have an X-Gen card that lives in the HDRadio exciter, the FM exciter with HDRadio capability. With a different software load, that card can also do DRM plus, and it can also, with a different software load, do China Digital Radio. And those topologies are similar. While they each call them something different, the function of exporter and importer, or the function of content server, exists in both of those digital radio architectures. So from a building block standpoint, while they have slightly different names, they're fairly similar. Now, a lot of times when we talk about a transition to digital, factually, the cost of some of these items is more expensive than what we might think of an analog. So if I was comparing an analog 10 kilowatt transmitter for a normal analog operation to one that could support HD radio, the HD radio device would be more expensive, in part because I need to have these other pieces. In DRM, it's called the content server, and HD radio, it's the importer and exporter, and this X-Gen card. But the savings, which might not be so obvious, is when you start looking at the cost to deploy a channel. Now, if I'm a single operator, I only run 99.5 in my market, and I have one channel. The idea of saying, well, I could run multiple audio channels on my same transmitter sounds like I'm adding more capabilities. However, in a shared infrastructure operation, I could actually run far less transmitters. So in this example, I could put 18 programs on a single DAB multiplex. So that's one transmitter, one frequency, one licensing fee, one link to get to the transmitter site, one sort of head end, and one sort of antenna system. Now, if I were running that in FM with one audio per channel, it's 18 of each of those things. Now, albeit I could have a combined antenna, but cost-wise, when I put combiners and a combined wideband antenna together, the costs are similar. You would save money on tower sites. Now, in HD radio, for example, and DRM, somewhat similar. Instead of putting them all on one transmitter, for example, like I could with DAB, I would use 5 transmitters. Now, it's important to note that this efficiency, if you will, changes. Its impact is different depending upon what your regulatory model and your operating model is. If, for example, you're in the United States with a commercial radio operation and I only have one or maybe 2 frequencies in a market, the savings of being able to run multiple channels on one transmitter may not be desirable or even possible. However, if I'm in a country where I have a nationwide network of frequencies, for example, if I'm running 6 or 8 channels today with 6 or 8 FM transmitters in every location to provide this nationwide coverage, or covering a state or a geography, the ability to put all of them on one set of infrastructure like DAB could actually be quite desirable. And in fact, if I'm a public service broadcaster and I've got 6 channels, and for example, there are other commercial broadcasters, I could share the infrastructure, and 3 or 4 operators now could be running on one set of shared infrastructure. So the cost per program drops pretty significantly when you look at a digital radio. While the costs of some of the individual components are more expensive, it's the cost per channel drops quite a bit. Now, the other thing that digital brings, and this is, while I'm doing the comparison to DAB, and I'll talk a little bit more about HD and DRM, but generally less power is needed for a similar coverage area. So now this comes from the robustness that comes from using the OFDM modulation. So if we just do a quick comparison here, if I'm running 100 kilowatt FM, if I look at the distance of a typical service coverage area, and then I compare it to a similar height and sighted transmitter using DAB, I would need about 10 kilowatts of ERP. Now, again, one is RMS, 10 kilowatts RMS, and the other's 100 kilowatts peak. So the efficiencies of the transmitters are different. But I use a much smaller transmitter, and I was kind of generous in my comparison, saying, and we'll look at the cost as we go forward, but I would use a very, very high gain antenna that would allow me to only run 10 kilowatts. Now, while in the US we tend not to see that ratio, in other parts of the world it's not uncommon to see very, very high gain antennas. So the comparison of transmitter size goes down significantly when you're in a digital only modulation. Now, when we talk about the efficiency of that, just as a reminder for efficiency, we're talking about how much power am I consuming as it compares to the power out, and then the difference is put off in waste heat. So, of course, we'd like for it to be 100% efficient. Once somebody figures that out, that will be great. In solid state transmitters, FM's been very efficient for a number of years, in excess of 70%, with best in class running somewhere in the mid to low 70% range for the full transmitter. A lot of times people talk about PA efficiency, which is much higher, but AC in to RF out. So if we use the same comparison and we look at the type of consumption, when we go across our previous example, a 10 kilowatt FM station versus a 2.5 kilowatt RMS transmitter, we look at the efficiency percentage. DAB transmitter, lower efficiency because it's linear, although efficiencies are much higher today than they were even 5 years ago. When DAB first came out, these transmitters were in the 18 to 20%, similar to digital television. But advances in digital correction and amplifiers have allowed them to become very efficient. So the consumption per transmitter, the FM transmitter consumes more power because, of course, it's running more power. But where you really start to see the power consumption difference is when you look at, I'm running 18 channels, and I can run those 18 channels on one DAB network. So when you look at the annual cost of energy, assuming 15 cents per kilowatt hour, the cost is a pretty staggering difference. Now, I did a similar comparison for HDRadio and DRM. They're somewhat similar. And we can see in the chart on the right that while we generally think of running an FM station and we know what its power consumption is and its efficiency percentage is pretty high, when you start realizing that I'm running, in this example, 18 transmitters to take the same number of audio channels as one, you can see why digital radio can be very efficient. And I think, again, I mentioned that it's important to understand what the regulatory and commercial environment is. So a lot of times, if you're in a North American environment where it's primarily commercial, we generally don't have while there's a public radio segment, it's not the same as a national government broadcaster. And while we have large commercial owners, we generally don't have nationwide networks. They're groups that own individual stations in a number of markets. But when you look at Europe, Australia, other parts of Asia, where people do run nationwide networks, both government and commercial, and they're running multiple channels, the BBC, NRK in Norway, the idea of running one digital network, we can see that the savings are pretty substantial. And so when people say, geez, why are guys converting to digital? There's a pretty significant dividend. And so when we take that operating cost and then we look at the cost to deploy, if I just capture transmitters, I'll set aside antennas, the cost of replacing all those FM transmitters is fairly significant. Even though cost per watt is less, I need more of them. So again, if I were, either buying new or I was replacing aging FM transmitters, and I needed to do it all at the same time, if I was looking at going digital, HDRadio, DRM, or DAB, I could spend a lot less money on new transmitters, and I would have a lot lower ongoing operating cost over a period of time. And so when we take a look at this, digital radio can give a pretty significant savings over a period of time. So if I was comparing, DAB plus to FM. In this example, the operating cost savings, even when we take into account the deployment, I save about $4.1 million over that 10-year period, and this would just be for one market. Now, if I use DRM plus or I used HDRadio, I have nearly the same savings amount, a little bit less because I run a few more transmitters. Now, these are really energy costs. That's not talking about I might have less aperture on the tower because I have shared antenna infrastructure. I have less floor space within the building because I'm consolidating all these audio channels to the same transmitter. So there are definitely some economic advantages, to digital, and the different topologies offer different advantages, and there are of course regulatory and spectrum requirements, but the cost per channel is significantly lower. Now I'll dig a little bit into some of the things relative to the market in HDRadio, and then we'll do similar for DAB and make some comments on DRM. So HDRadio, we're into over a decade of deployments, nearing almost 2 decades now. And in total, there are around 4,500 channels of digital on the air, nearly 2,300 transmitters. Now Mexico has deployed as well, and they've got almost 120 on, and in Canada there's at last count around 33. So North America, this is clearly the standard of choice. It's been regulatorily approved in Mexico and the United States, and it's in an experimental mode in Canada, but generally is the modulation of choice. Now, there's always dialogue around are there different standards, and I think if we've learned anything from digital television, because we went through competing standards here in the US and other countries have done the same thing. Generally, success comes from picking a standard and working hard to deploy it successfully. There'll always be technology changes, and you can certainly make the changes at some later point, but only when everyone works together to drive the same outcome. Now, if we look for HDRadio globally, I think it's fair to say that it's had a lot more attention in the Americas than any place else. So in addition to the US and Mexico, it's been deployed in Panama, Trinidad, Tobago, Dominican, Puerto Rico. Now, we've deployed some in Brazil. In fact, back around 2005, we deployed several there in kind of an experimental mode. And Brazil continues to, have interest in digital radio, but is as of yet picked a standard. Similar developments in Colombia and Peru. Some experimentation and testing in Eastern Europe, some also in India and Bangladesh. We've deployed some there that's been operating, and in the Philippines. So it is indeed a global standard, but much like digital standards for televisions, each regional geography has a different viewpoint. If you were looking at DAB, for example, you would see deployments in Europe and Australia and some other parts of Asia, and not really anything in the Americas. I mentioned receivers. Again, if we were here in the early days of any digital standard, whether it was TV or radio, finding a receiver always has been a challenge. The good news, I'll say, is that the HDRadio group has worked pretty hard to try to get receivers deployed and readily available. So today, if we take the US, for example, about half of the cars have factory installed HDRadio receivers. And so generally, there are nearly 9 million new receivers coming to the market every year, and the market now has about 61 million receivers. So, that's fairly significant. Does everyone have an HD receiver? No, but when we think about it, it's a pretty high percentage of the population, especially because a lot of radio listening is done in cars. That's an ideal target for that. I mentioned cars. Here just kind of shows you, the growth over time and the importance of receivers for mass adoption. And I guess if we went further to the left, the bars would be even lower. We would get excited about aftermarket radios that you could get from Kenwood and, buy them from, an online a stereo store. But, virtually all the major brands have a significant number of models represented and a significant numbers of vehicles. So, if you look at the end of last year, there were, 41 brands that had, a high percentage of models that had HDRadio as standard in them. So, very good progress from that standpoint, making HDRadio receivers far more available than they used to be. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting, and this was some research that was done a couple years ago, but it was trying to understand is the user experience for digital, how satisfied were people, and so generally, people were very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. So when you kind of look at it, there's always a concern that you get new technology and people don't see the value or don't find that it delivers something. I think anyone who watched the first content of HDTV after watching analog, either PAL or NTSC, it was a pretty dramatic experience. In digital radio, if I'm listening to a great analog station and I go to digital, I may not see the same night and day difference that I saw going from analog TV to digital TV. And so sometimes that can, I think, lead us to think that there's no big difference, but clearly consumers do find that that it can live up to its expectations. Now we'll talk a little bit about DAB in a similar view. If we go back, there were really a core markets in Europe that were the only places. Australia followed closely behind with deployment in all their capital cities in about the same period of time, slightly beyond that. And this has led to actually countries now switching off FM and making the conversion. So Norway in 2017 turned off analog for all their nationwide networks. Now there are still some broadcasters and community stations on analog, but all the commercial networks and the government networks have switched. And at GatesAir, we were fortunate enough to be the transmission provider for the network and deployed well over 3,000 transmitters with our partner Telnor Norkring there. And this is one a lot of people kind of go, geez, I can't believe they're turning off analog FM. But the economics I talked about earlier were exactly what were driving it. So both the commercial broadcasters and the government broadcasters were facing a replacement of their entire network of analog FM. So the government had 6 nationwide channels, NRK, I think cleverly NRK 1 through 6, and then there were 2 or 3 other commercial networks. And so they were looking at a big cost to upgrade, as well as continued high operating costs. And so when they did the analysis, they determined that they could save well over $10 million a year in their distribution costs by switching to digital. So pretty significant. Switzerland's given a target date of 2024. They've had a pretty broad DAB usage over the past number of years. UK has a broad network for both commercial and government broadcasters, the BBC, and that has both nationwide channels as well as regional or local channels. So nearly 60% of all radio listening is done on digital. Germany, although it was one of the leaders in the trial, is in the early days of DAB. Launched its first nationwide multiplex in the past couple of years, is adding another multiplex this year. Italy has fairly broad adoption, and again, we've been fortunate to help deploy there. And starting in 2020, all new receivers must have DAB+ across them. We're continuing to see across Europe both high levels of coverage and new markets turning on, new launches of digital radio. France, we've been on the air from the Eiffel Tower for some time, and in some of the larger markets, they're starting to deploy into the mid-sized markets now. So there continues to be steady digital radio growth there. So, as kind of a benchmark, there are about 45 countries that now have DAB or DAB Plus deployed around the world. Over 500 million people have access to these signals. And, they're not just some of the big European countries. We've deployed in Thailand and Vietnam. GatesAir's personally been involved in those. Other countries and other suppliers have supported places like Serbia and Azerbaijan. So there's a pretty broad adoption. Now, we talked about the number of channels. What this has also allowed people to do, not only have shared infrastructure, but in the same shared infrastructure, more channels are available. So just giving a quick snapshot, the blue bar represents the types of nationwide services available. So in the UK, there were 8. There are now 55 services using digital. In Italy, just shy of 50. The Netherlands, more than double what they had. Norway has now shut off analog, so there are 32 nationwide services, and Germany had only had 2 nationwide FM services, and now there are 13. So digital delivers in additional content as well. So we talked about HD radio with a broad number of receivers. DAB really has done an excellent job and probably led the market in deployment of digital receivers. Over 80 million have been sold, and they're fairly inexpensive prices for like a small tabletop radio, or around 20 euros. And deployment in cars is fairly significant. So of course, Norway, 100% of new cars all have a digital radio. The UK, it's 95%, 90% in Switzerland, Australia, 3/4 of them, Italy, nearly half, Germany and the Netherlands are fairly close as well. So we continue to see, pretty mass adoption of receivers that are readily available. So much so that the EU mandated that car radios starting in, at the end of 2020, start deploying digital. So if you have radio, it also needs to provide digital radio. And, there are some small costs associated with this. There are, several dollars and some licensing fees and so forth on a software-defined chip, but the cost to deploy is fairly low. Now, there have been some advancements in DAB recently that aid in lowering the cost of deployment. So while we talked about the fact that you can have multiple audio channels per transmitter, which makes the cost per channel very low, GatesAir introduced in the past 18 months a new product that actually allows you to put up to 3 either adjacent or closely spaced multiplexes out of the same transmitter. So now if we used our example of 18 channels per multiplex, in this case, we could have 3 of those multiplexes of 18 channels in the same transmitter. So this allows, if I have several multiplexes and I need to have boosters or fill-ins, it can make the cost to deploy those very cost effective. And it does so I don't need a separate passive bandpass filters for each multiplex. I do around the whole cluster of them, but digital pre-correction allows us to reduce out-of-band emissions between the channels, and at a very high MER. 38 is quite high in DAB. The benchmark's somewhere around 25 to 30. And then similarly is a variant of some of our television platforms. There's an outdoor unit that's been deployed that allows all the pieces of a transmitter for low power up to 70 watts to live inside a box that might be mounted on a rooftop or a pole. So again, when filling in a network, the cost to deploy has been pretty dramatically reduced, because now I don't need a building or a room or a shelter to put my products in, the transmitter, the satellite receiver, the IP connectivity for monitoring or transport. So I could go directly off satellite into one of these boxes to an antenna. So DAB's had some pretty significant developments. DRM on the receiver side, while there are several available now, and most notably India is the largest country of adoption for DRM, the number of receivers while growing is still relatively small. And so by comparison, the other two digital standards have a wide number of receivers. China Digital Radio, it too has had some decent adoption of receivers, but frankly, those receiver, shipment information is not readily available in China. But I can tell you can go into most, electronic stores and you can actually buy them there, and they're not incredibly expensive. So I think, when we talk about digital radio, we continue to see consumer demand for a lot of different types of content, including content coming from, other sources such as streaming and, podcasts and other such methods, satellite radio, in addition to traditional linear broadcast radio. Radio still is the most dominant, and so this insatiable demand for more content, as we can see from some of these countries where we've got a lot more channels, even here in the US, the 5,000 channels of digital, there is a consumer for these. Is it going to always be the most number of people consuming every channel? Of course not, because it's a diverse audience, but still a lot of demand. I think we can pretty clearly see when you look at the cost per audio channel, digital radio lowers the cost of deployment fairly significantly, as well. The operating costs are much lower. Some advancements in technologies that we talked about really allow the footprint to get a lot smaller, which also helps drive the cost down, and the knock-on effects of savings from facility space and cooling and construction, as well as some of these advances in transmitters that allow us to do fill-in for fairly low cost. And similar for HD radio, I covered on the SFN topic earlier that reduction in HD radio transmitters have gotten much smaller, so single frequency network boosters to add coverage have become far more cost effective. And I think, if we look at it practically, receivers are pretty widely available for HD radio and DAB with good pickup in the cars. So, when we think about it overall, every company that's going to deploy in every country that's picking standards and picking their deployment, the choices they all make, everyone's situation's a little bit different. But, digital radio offers a pretty cost-effective platform for delivery of content. And that's, I should note, not just limited to audio channels, which I kind of mostly used in this example, but there's a number of rich media types of content that are delivered from, real-time traffic updates linked to displays in cars, which is common with HD radio. Other such digital signage and data delivery has been done for years with DAB platforms. So a pretty cost-effective way to deliver content. So I'll be glad to take any questions that might be queued up.
All right, thanks, Rich. Before we get into the Q&A portion, I just want to make a couple of announcements. During these announcements, feel free to post your questions. We have several in the queue already, and we'll get to them in the order in which they were received. Just to make a note that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the same link that you used to sign in today. It'll also be available on GatesAir.com in our media section and on our YouTube channel. Give those just a couple of days for those to be posted, but they will be out there eventually. In addition, we will be adding the webinar to our educational video library at GatesAirUniversity.com, which is our online hub of lessons and webinars about broadcast engineering. Also, if you didn't know, those of you in the United States, this webinar, like all of the webinars on GatesAir.com, do qualify for a half SBE recertification credit identified under Category I of the SBE's recertification schedule. And if you need more information about that, please visit the certification section at sbe.org. So now on to the questions. We have one from Scott Todd. is there anywhere we can hear is there anywhere that we can hear A/B comparisons between MA1, MA3, and analog CQAM AM stereo?
Yeah, good questions, Scott. You know, I don't know of one that's got active, an active comparison. You know, it's quite possible that somebody has recordings of CQAM and you could run the same content through HDRadio and be able to do the comparisons. But I don't know. There might be, but I don't know of a location that's, has one station set up running CQAM and, perhaps another running, digital radio that you could do a comparison on that. I would think perhaps the team at Xperi may be able to help you with that. And I know they've done some extensive testing with the station in Metro Washington, D.C. in an all digital mode. And so, again, they may have some benchmark testing, but I'm not aware of any that could give you that side by side.
All right, on to the next question. Apologies for if I mispronounce your name. The question is coming from Katan Dutkia. The question is, in HDRadio digital content on sideband, what is the tuning frequency for HDRadio? Is it the same as analog frequency during simulcast transmission, or is it different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it generally follows a similar approach as used in television, digital TV. So you tune in, I'll pick the one I've been using all day. You pick 99.5 megahertz. In analog, I tune to 99.5 and I hear the station. So in HDRadio, it grabs the analog carrier first, and then once it is able to demodulate the digital carriers, it switches to the digital copy, or what we call HD1, for listening to the same content in digital. And then if it has multicast or HD2, 3, and 4, then as you turn your knob to the right, like you in analog would have been going to, in the US to 99.7, it would go, HD2, HD3, HD4, and then it would tune to the next channel. So it logically tunes much like if I tune to channel 23 in digital TV, I would then go to tune up and it would go to its HD2 or, HD3, the sub channels by channel number, but it tunes to the main frequency first.
Awesome. We have another question from Katan. If the customer would like to upgrade in digital radio, HD or DRM plus, what other components would need to be replaced in RF chain? For example, the combiner, RF cable, RF antenna.
Oh, what are the other pieces? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it depends on, frankly, what pieces you already have that may be able to be reused. So generally what we find is that most antennas, not all, but most, have enough bandwidth to allow the digital carriers to pass. Most feed line has enough headroom in it to allow the digital carriers to pass and not exceed, any voltage breakdown or power requirements. So from that standpoint, in a lot of cases, the antenna and transmission line is able to be reused. Now, in some cases, that's not true, especially if it's in a combined environment. In some cases, the filters might not have the appropriate bandwidth, or the antenna might not be able to handle enough power. So every site's a little bit different, but unlike a transmitter that would only be transmitting analog needs to be linearized to take HDRadio, some of them can be upgraded, and chances are pretty good if you bought a transmitter in the past 10 years from one of the major suppliers, they're capable of upgrading. Do keep in mind when you linearize the transmitter and add digital, the peak power that it's able to deliver for FM is diminished. So if I was running 10 kilowatts out of a 10 kilowatt transmitter for analog, and I wanted to continue to run 10 kilowatts, but add HDRadio subchannels, I would need to get a properly sized transmitter to be able to pass the digital subchannels and my main analog channel. So in essence, even if I was able to convert it, I would need a larger transmitter to be able to still make my licensed power.
Awesome. We have a question from Anonymous. Isn't it true that 18 FMs or 6 HDRadio DRM plus stations could cover a larger area than a single DAB plus, since the 18 DAB plus channels are by necessity co-located?
Well, yeah, I was doing an apples to apples comparison, assuming that if I was in a city and I had multiple channels that I was running, I would need 18 transmitters, for example, to do those 18 channels, where in a good sized market, I could have a third of the market, for example, on one DAB transmitter. Now, yeah, of course, if you chose to only have 2 of them in that one market and 2 of them in some other place and 2 of them in another place, of course, if you spread the FM transmitters out to different geographies, they could, of course, cover a much larger area. But, what generally we see, especially when I talk about, networks. And again, that's why I mentioned, look, it's somewhat based on what your operating model is. But for most public service broadcasters or nationwide commercial operators, they use common sites to cover generally the same geography. So if I'm, in the case of Norway, NRK, and I have 6 FM stations, every site has this replication of 6 transmitters. And then similarly, the commercial nationwide broadcasters had their, and I think there were also 6 or 7 commercial broadcasters, I don't remember exactly, they all ran from the same site. So these 12 or 13 FM transmitters all ran from the same site to provide that number of audio channels over a certain market. So yes, of course, if you spread the FM transmitters out, of course, you could cover a larger geography. But, if we think about covering a major city, and that was kind of the benchmark here for, picking the 18, the coverage area of the FM transmitters is in a co-located site or nominally co-located. We think of a tower farm on top of a, a mountain or mountain range, versus DAB.
The next question comes again from Katan. In DAB Plus, when we talked about 18 programs, it means all programs would be running on the same bit rates, or bit rate vary based on program content dependent, like music, vocal, news, etc.
Yeah, the example I just picked a common bit rate, but every channel can be tailored in the head end. So when I kind of talked about this encoding or head end, so in HDRadio, we had kind of an example of different bit rates for the channels. In DAB, I just kind of talked about them all being the same, and the same for DRM. Factually, the encoding and multiplexing function, so importer and exporter in HDRadio, content server in DRM, and generally referred to as a DAB head end in DAB, you can control the audio quality and bandwidth by channel, so in mono and stereo. So if you had a sports talk station or a news station and you determine, look, I don't need stereo audio, I only want to run mono, that could be at its own compression algorithm and its own bit rate. And similarly, if I had one that was classical music, for argument's sake, or jazz, and I wanted it to be very high fidelity, I could run much higher bit rate. So it's totally tailorable based on each channel.
The next, I believe it's a statement, perhaps. It's from Anonymous. It says, Australia started high-powered DAB Plus in 2009.
Yes, correct. Yeah, and I think when I was talking about 10 years ago, so I was off a little bit, but that's for sure true. So each of the capital cities runs high power DAB Plus to cover the network. In fact, I think Australia is uniquely the place that runs the highest DAB powers I've seen anywhere. So they have generally a single high power site that covers the metro. Now they do have some single frequency gap fillers, and much like the example I showed with these multiple carriers, Australia has three large multiplexes. I think the commercial networks and then the government networks, and they generally emanate from the same site. So yes, Australia was fairly early in the deployment, not quite as early as Europe, but I would say they really were the driver of the implementation of AAC Plus as an algorithm that now became widely used. So they launched a DAB Plus when they launched. They never were on the traditional DAB.
The next question is from Katan. Can you provide more details regarding emergency warning systems in digital radio?
Yeah, so, emergency warning systems. So all the systems that are used in analog today can easily be made available to work on DAB, for example. So if you're using a version of EAS like are used in North America, or there are other warning systems that have been deployed in Japan and Europe and other places, those are all available. But in addition, there are a number of signaling systems where data can be sent out to receivers that can unlock the receiver and make a special announcement and so forth. So I would say the thing about early warning systems is they're generally a function of the regulation, and the regulations are different per country. So it's not like, I'll just pick an object. It's not like a microphone or CD player or even an FM transmitter where it's virtually ubiquitous and you can use it in any place. The early warning systems are all a little bit different, based on the regulation, but generally anything that we've seen done, in analog radio can easily be deployed in digital. And frankly, with the use of radio text and program associated data, a lot of the things that we see in television, like a text crawl on a screen and some of these other things, can also be done pretty easily in digital radio.
Okay, the next question comes from JP Firminger, who has a client with a 50 kilowatt DR2 AM station. Any problems with HD when 6 towers are used to form the protection patterns? Or do you have any more details on comparisons as you have shown for FM?
Yeah, so if I think I'm understanding, AM has its what I was showing kind of was the passband of the frequencies against adjacencies. Now, in AM, it's somewhat similar. There's still a shoulder and passband, but then you're also talking about in a directional antenna about the amount of power that goes in each of the directions, and protecting different stations. So I would say first, most AM directional systems need some attention to properly pass HD. So even before we get into, protecting adjacent channels, especially at 6 towers, it's very possible that the bandwidth can be limited on that. So I would say, if I was thinking of deploying on AM, there'd be a couple things I would look at. First, whether you did that or you had a consulting engineer or someone with the appropriate tools could help you evaluate the bandwidth of the antenna system and determine if there are any areas that need to have some improvements, because that's important. Now, actually, one of the good things is most AM transmitters, as opposed to FM, most contemporary ones can add HD radio. So, if you had something from one of the major suppliers, even a relatively old DX transmitter, which has never had PDM filters, can pass HD radio or DRM fairly easily. But, the contemporary PDM transmitters also can do that. But things like your phaser and antenna tuning units and such, you're going to need to understand if it's got the passband capabilities. And then, relative to what the interference might be, I don't know what your situation is, but I would say, I would work with your technical consultant on, or FCC consultant to take a look at your antenna system, frankly, there are a lot of guys who are very capable at doing that that could help you. So AM's a little bit more complex because the antenna system's massive, and factually, they haven't always had ample bandwidth. And in honesty, these were similar things that needed to be done when people had been looking at adding AM stereo. The bandwidth in the antenna system could impact performance.
Okay, the next question comes from Anonymous. There is a 6-channel DRM plus modulator. Will your VHF TV transmitter radiate this 600 kilohertz wide signal in 47 to 68 megahertz band?
47 to 68. So I think, so I guess the first thing I would say is today we don't have DRM modulation in our band 1 television transmitter, so it's a little bit different platform than the radio platform. But that being said, we certainly could take a look at that. We've interfaced other modulations, especially in the developmental phase. When we were doing ATSC3, frankly, we did an interface to a computer that did the modulation. But the thing that I'm trying to remember was the lowest frequency that we went to for VHF. And I was trying to remember off the top of my head, but we do go down to channel 2, which I thought was 50 megahertz, so it's probably pretty close. So the short answer is yes, we could probably get, if you've got a modulator that could do that, we could get the RF signal in. There's probably some matching relative to enough drive power and some control, but the amplifiers would definitely be able, they're very linear. Now, the one thing that we do need to keep in mind is for high efficiency these days, and this is more a function of digital television, an amplifier technique called Doherty has been deployed across all our TV transmitters for high efficiency. And this requires that there's some pretty sophisticated digital pre-correction that's done. And frankly, not all modulators have that. So while it's probably getting the waveform in from, say, a DRM modulator into a channel 2 TV transmitter, I'm certain we could do. There would be somewhat of a science fair project to figure out the correction. What that may mean is that the unit would have to be run in a very backed off mode to allow the amplifiers to be a lot more linear, because the outboard modulator may not have the sophisticated pre-correction. So look, I would encourage you to, get in contact with us and we'd be glad to take a look at it. But, it's not plug and play for certain, but, with enough effort, I'm sure that something could be worked out.
The next question comes from Anonymous. Is DAB slated to happen in the US 220 megahertz?
No. So, that's the short answer. Some time ago, I guess 20 plus years ago, DAB was looked at for North America. Canada did some very early deployments in L-band from the CN Tower and some other places. And, frankly, they proved to be not very successful. Digital TV in the United States, still uses an awful lot of VHF spectrum. Not that there may not be some available, but, the recent spectrum auction and repack in digital television, moved more people back into VHF from UHF. So, one, it's not a modulation that's approved or allowed today. And, while I haven't done an exhaustive study, I think we would find that there wouldn't be spectrum available for it. And frankly, some of that's in part, the deployment of frequencies in the US for radio and TV is a little bit different in Europe. As I mentioned, the European model and in other parts of the world too, especially where there's strong national government broadcasters, there's a lot of shared infrastructure. So, take for the example, the BBC. They have one multiplex, in some cases regional multiplexes, but there's a multiplex that they run all their channels on. Similarly, the commercial TV stations generally have one or two multiplexes that they all run on, where in the United States, each of the networks or groups generally own their own frequencies or have a license for them, but own their own infrastructure. So, while there has been some channel sharing in the spectrum repack, it's generally not broadly deployed. So the regulatory environment's a little bit different. So it's probably a long answer to your question, but I would say I really can't see a future where, from a regulatory standpoint, DAB would be adopted here. And frankly, it would be kind of swimming against the stream. HDRadio is pretty broadly deployed. It's made a lot of regulatory progress. It's got receiver density, as we saw, and a good number of broadcasters have invested in it. Not everyone for sure, but there are a good number, and it has nationwide coverage.
Okay, the next is more of a comment probably than anything. It comes from Ben Dawson, and it's in response to the AM question.
Oh, great.
Both pattern and bandwidth and transmitter load bandwidth are important in directional antenna situations. There is a report that Ron Rackley's firm and Ben Dawson's firm did for the CPB that shows the magnitude of these problems.
Oh, excellent. Well, and thank you, Ben. When I was mentioning that there are capable people in the, kind of your FCC consultant, this Ben would be one of the top guys I would suggest. So thanks for pointing out that resource. And I think, Teresa, let's see if we can't, maybe find a link to that and include that when we post our information here.
Sure.
Thanks, Ben. That was helpful.
That looks like the last of our questions. So I just wanted to thank Rich for your presentation and everyone for asking the questions today, and thank you for your participation. Once again, this webinar recording will be available on GatesAir.com, our YouTube channel, or by using the same link that you used to view the live presentation. It will also appear on GatesAirUniversity.com, which may take a day or so to get posted. Join us again Thursday, May 7th at 10 a.m. or 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time for our next virtual event webinar, Total Cost of Ownership, the Economics of Deploying High-Efficiency Transmitters, presented by longtime engineer and senior product line manager for television transmission, Martin Horspool. He'll cover high-efficiency transmitters are the cornerstone of low TCO. Though many other factors are equally important, Martin will review all of the major drivers of total cost of ownership, including repairability, modularity, footprint, and several other factors that help you select a reliable transmitter that will provide you cost-effective operation through the life of the product. For more information about this webinar and other special events that we have coming up, visit gatesair.com/v-events. And if you have ideas for future webinar topics or course material for GatesAir University, please let us know at marketing@gatesair.com. Thanks again for attending this GatesAir Connect virtual event. From all of us at GatesAir, stay safe, stay happy, and let's stay connected.